Okay.
Hello, Chica.
Hey, Chica.
Hello, everybody. How are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you doing?
Huh? Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes.
yes, we can. We'll just wait a couple more minutes. People
Hi,
often join
Chica.
right on the dot. So
Oh, hi there.
We are both in Canberra, but we hardly see each other.
That's the beauty of it, isn't
We're
it?
happy to bring you together. We're happy to unite you.
Thank
I
you.
know. It takes AI1 and AI2 to bring the two people in the same choir together. Oh, wow.
I say some familiar names. Many.
yeah, we'll just give it till about 3 minutes past and then we'll get started, I think.
Sounds good. Okay.
Laptop's falling through. It's like okay, well, it's 3 minutes past, so I think we'll make a start. So welcome, everybody. My name is Professor Farida Fosdar. I'm the Dean Global Futures and a Professor of Sociology here at Curtin University. I'm also one of the chief investigators for the Australian Research Council project that the talk today is generated from. And I'll tell you a little bit about our speakers shortly, but before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the Bentley campus of Curtin, which is on the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation here in the southwest of Perth, Western Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, and signal our appreciation for the custodianship of the land that we benefit from in our daily lives here. And I'm sure that you all feel the same for the areas that you are coming from. So yeah, we're very pleased today to be able to bring you a focus of some of the data from our research project. This is, I think, the 6th in our webinar series, and the focus today is on the gendered nature of political and economic agency among migrant Black women, Black migrant African women in Australia. And this was a topic that was suggested by Nothando Ngwenya, who is one of our speakers today. And I think our speakers have put together a really interesting presentation for you, looking at the project overall is focused on the ways in which the African diaspora in Australia contributes to the Australian society in a range of ways. Particularly, our focus has been on political agency and on economic agency. And so this presentation will focus on the ways in which women contribute in that sense. So I'll give you a little bit of background on the project itself. So if we can move to the next slide. So this is the project team. This was a picture taken 3 years ago at our very first meeting where we were all together. And the research, as you can see, our objective, by all means, move on to the next one, is to try to challenge some of the critical narrative that has been in the political sphere, in the media, and so on, about Africans in Australia, and to extend the research base. A lot of the research has been undertaken with particular communities, and particularly people who've come through the refugee intake. And we thought, well, we'll do that by looking at 2 elements of contributions, in the political sphere and in the economic sphere. And we're looking at the different waves of migrants as well, people who've been here for longer and people who've been here for shorter, or who were second generation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we've used a number of methods in which to try to answer our research question around the contributions being made. We've undertaken a very large census, and some of the data that our speakers will be sharing with you comes from that. We did do already a presentation that focused on that data. We've looked at existing data from National Survey and elsewhere. We've looked at policy documents, done a little bit of an analysis of those, and also looked at social media, the ways in which African communities and community organizations represent themselves. And we've done a set of interviews with community members, community leaders, African diplomats, and also Australian political leaders. As you know, if you've been attending this webinar series, we've been trying to share elements from each of these different methods that we've been undertaking. Thank you. Next slide. So moving right along. So our speakers, we're very pleased to have Ruvi Goredema. Ruvi is a PhD student. She's working on the project, and her research looks specifically at the ways in which African communities work together, form organizations in order to try to, in order to exercise their agency and to provide I guess, structures through which the communities can engage with each other, through which they can undertake voluntary activities, through which they can build community. Ruvi comes with a background in she's got a master's in political communication from the University of Cape Town. Our other speaker today is Nothando Ngwenya. Nothando herself has a master's in international development from the University of Western Australia. She's currently doing a master's, which is likely to upgrade into a PhD, looking at the black tax, the remittances that African migrants in Australia send back home. So we're very pleased to have our speakers. And before I hand over completely, I'd just like to let people know that we are recording this session. So if you don't want to be seen, please turn your camera off. However, if you're happy to, it's always nice to have cameras on so that the speakers have someone to interact with. Please remember to turn off your microphones. And yeah, if you have any comments, feel free to include them in the chat as we are going through the webinar. And we'll have time for questions at the end, so you can ask questions through that format as well, or there will be an opportunity to ask questions verbally at the end as well. So thank you very much to Ruvi and Nothando. We look forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Farida, and thank you to everybody who has attended. I'm seeing some familiar faces, which make me more nervous than I am with my PhD supervisor. But so thank you all for coming today. As Farida pointed out, this is part of a project that sits within the African Impact in Australia project that's funded by the Australia Research Council. And from the outset, we want to be able to name that I am also a Black African migrant woman living and working in Australia. And it's really important to name that because it's not incidental to what we're doing today. It's actually the very reason of why we're doing this today.
And I just want to say something a little interesting about the title. Some of you may know some of the words that we're going to use. So the official title of the webinar is The Gendered Nature of Political and Economic Agency Among Black Migrant Women in Australia. But when we first started preparing for it, we wanted to call it Elephants and Chitenges. So for those who don't know, a chitenge, or some people pronounce it chitenge, is a piece of cloth or fabric that African women from most countries will wear around their waists, you know, in their day-to-day lives, or if there's ceremonies or anything of that nature. So we wanted to use the elephant as a symbol that we are unpacking quite interesting concepts through this presentation, and then to use the chitenges to describe the fabric of how the subjects of our presentation, which is Black migrant women, is woven throughout everything that we're going to discuss today.
All right. And in the spirit of research, a couple of disclaimers. So this is not a polished set of final findings. You know, it's a deliberate gendered reading of one subset of a very large data set that we're working with, shared during, we thought it's important to share during Women's Month. And it's an invitation for all of us to be part of the process of the research in itself. And we let the data teach us, and we're still learning. And also, Nothando and I don't always agree on how to interpret that data. So that productive disagreement is also part of that presentation, not something that we just wanted to smooth over. Right. The slide that you're looking at carries a line that I want to read aloud and have that sit for a moment. As I've said before, we come to this data as Black migrant African women researchers studying their own communities in Australia. We're saying that it's not a standard disclosure because it's a methodological and ethical position. We're inside the subject that we're studying, and that creates what the slide names as the methodological tension. The survey instrument has limits, but the lived experience and the qualitative interviews expose those limits. The questions about political confidence cannot fully capture what it costs women who work and juggle multiple things and also are politically active. And it creates what the slide calls insider-outsider paradox. We're not disinterested observers. We're researching communities we belong to, peoples whose realities mirror our own in some ways and also differ quite sharply. And we've tried to hold that tension honestly rather than pretend that it doesn't exist. And the third point, the one that I want you to hold throughout the session, as we've said, we have disagreements, and we would like you definitely to observe these and also contribute in the chat.
Okay, so as Farida mentioned earlier, the project does ask a few research questions. And one of the research questions it asks is, how does political and economic agency vary among African migrants in Australia across race, country of origin, ethnicity, gender, age, migration era, visa category, and geography. Obviously, we're not answering this whole question in this webinar because that would be too big, but we are going to be talking about gender. So just wanting to point this out again. And also to note that in the presentation, we won't be answering this research question in full. We're just going to discuss the findings and our interpretations of it as well. And so just letting you know that we are conducting a deliberate gendered reading of one subset of the data, as Ruvi just mentioned. Also, we'd like to mention that we did not test a hypothesis going into this. So we did take an inductive approach and we're allowing the data to teach us, and whatever we present is findings from the data that was presented. So in the next 35 to 40 minutes or so, we're going to share with you what we explored and what this taught us.
Right. So before we go into this, let's address the elephant in the room. And the elephant is the way research talks about communities, particularly migrant communities historically. And this is something that our project has also encompassed. The slide in front of you asks, what is a deficit narrative in research? And it answers this with 4 panels. Who? The researchers, media, policymakers, and institutions. What framing of that, the positions of the communities through disadvantage or lack, or through strengths, or not through strengths or self-determined goals, and how we are inviting communities to speak, but not only from a place of deprivation and historical trauma. And this matters because if we begin from damage, we'll only ever find damage. So one of the scholars that we've looked at is Eve Tuck, and she named this in 2009. And the quote at the bottom of the slide is hers, and I want to read it carefully. Research that invites oppressed peoples to speak, but only to speak from that space in the margin that is a sign of deprivation, a wound, and unfulfilled longing. Only speak your pain. We're refusing that framing today, and that's not naivety. What we're saying is there's pain, but that's not the organizing framework agency is.
And so we'd also like to define agency as the project defines it. And you see from the quote at the top of this slide that the project aims to examine the nature and the orientation of purposive political and economic activity of Africans in Australia, and the social and institutional structures that shape, facilitate, and constrain the pursuits of political and economic goals. And from this, we see 3 dimensions following from it, which we have on the slide as well. So these are political consciousness, which is the ideas, influences, and factors that shape political activity, voting preferences, and Pan-African identity. We also have political agency, which is the extent to which Africans in Australia feel empowered and how organizations and leadership facilitate wider political goals. And thirdly, we have economic agency, which is employment, entrepreneurship, remittances, sending money back home, transnational economic activity, and how these connect back to people's political agency. So our focus today will sit across all 3 of them. And what we are asking is, does gender shape how these dimensions operate? And as you'll see in the discussion, we believe that the data suggests that it does, and we'll share some examples of how this looks. So the operative framework for today's presentation is this. I love a spectrum. So when we decided that there's a spectrum, I was very excited. But basically, we suggest that agency sits on a spectrum consisting of a range of interconnected registers, which are all legitimate in their functionality. So from the first register of the spectrum, we're beginning at everyday cultural activity, which may look like a picnic, a WhatsApp network, a hike. These factors help to create belonging, solidarity, and serve as the infrastructure of the community. Secondly, we have community building, which may manifest in a credit group, a cooperative, or peer mentoring. And these are all examples that we're going to expand on later on today as well. And we're going to use examples from an illustrative case study yet to be introduced by Ruvi. Third, there's political mobilization, which may present itself in ministerial briefings and legislative submissions. And so you can see on the screen the WA Multicultural Act consultation, which we will come back to as well. And finally, at the final end, we have resistance and critique, which could present itself, for example, in anti-racism research or refusing to use deficit narratives in everyday life. And this webinar, in some small way, sits there. So what the spectrum allows us to do is to resist the idea that agency only counts when it looks like a politician at a podium. The women in our data are exercising agency across this entire range, and the question is whether we know how to see it.
Hi. The question driving the discussion is in the left panel of the slide. How does gender shape the pursuit of political and economic goals? And where does that agency actually live? The right panel holds a note on where we are. It's a preliminary study. We didn't go in with a hypothesis, we're just curious. We're going to be using an organization called Black Girls Level Up as our illustrative case study. And the slide shows the BGLU logo. One key fact, this is an organization that informally started in 2021 and incorporated in February 2025, based in Perth, Western Australia. It's a collective of Black African women in corporate Australia, living and a working example of agency, operating across that full spectrum that Nothando just described, from picnics to parliamentary submissions. We're using it because it's not that it's the only example, but because it represents a little bit of what it's like to be a Black African woman in Australia today, and we want to make that data visible. Now, I want to be very transparent with you, and I think I've hit it on the nose, right? I'm part of the founding members of BGLU, and it's precisely why I can speak to its work with specificity. And we've been deliberate about trying to keep an analytical distance. So we may wave in and out, but you can call us out. But Nothando is going to be looking at the survey interpretations, and I'll bring in the community illustration. The survey leads, BGLU responds, and that's the structure that's going to follow.
Okay, so as we go into now the meat of our discussion, I'll take you through 3 themes represented by 3 sets of questions we have clustered from our data sources. So for each theme, we'll discuss the project survey findings, and then Ruvi will provide the texture to this from some of our interview data and the case study mentioned, BGLU. And just as a reminder, you are welcome to share your thoughts in the chat throughout or at the end of the presentation as well. And our moderator will be holding that chat as well. So that being said, let's go into the meat of everything. So a quick word before we start on the themes. I just want to introduce 3 data sources that speak to each other, which we'll be referencing. So just a reminder, we have a nationwide survey data, which Farida mentioned, with responses from just over 830 Africans in Australia. And we just want to note that these responses have been weighted to adjust the sample so that they're calibrated to be more representative, because we didn't really get a representative sample when people were completing the survey. And then alongside the survey, we've picked 7 qualitative interviews, all given by African women, which serve to illustrate the numbers in the survey responses. And we'll be using quotes from these women who will be identifying by pseudonyms that we've given them and descriptors of how we interpret a dimension of their being. And then finally, we'll have BGLU as our case study, which we'll discuss in more detail later. So our first theme is political engagement. So the survey asked respondents a few questions about their political engagement, including whether they contacted politicians to discuss social issues, and if they thought Australian politicians cared about issues affecting Africans in Australia, and how confident they felt discussing politics. And the responses from these 3 particular questions told us that 82% of the women in the survey have contacted a politician about an issue they care about, which is the same amount of contacting that men who completed the survey have done as well. So if you stop the analysis there, you would say that there is no gender gap in political experiences between men and women, with women being as politically active as men. But when you look at the next question, we see that it seems that only 10% of women think that Australian politicians care about the issues that affect them, and only 42% of women feel confident in discussing politics versus 56% of men. And this 14-point gap in confidence was quite interesting, sitting alongside the identical contact rates that may suggest something more important about the political engagement of African migrant women. At the very least, it tells us that despite low confidence in the cost of their efforts, or the ability to discuss politics, African women who fit the description of the people who completed the survey are still actively engaged in politics. So Ruvi, what does BGLU provide as a perspective?
Well, BGLU gives us one possible illustration, and I want to trace it really carefully because it may show how political agency is actually compounding. In 2025, the BGLU members attended a Meet the Minister community event organized by the Office of Multicultural Interests. At that event, BGLU members met Minister Tony Booty, the Minister of State for Multicultural Interests. The purpose was deliberate, to introduce to his ministry, BGLU, and to really state explicitly that there's an organization of Black professional women in Western Australia who are seeking sponsorship and access to his circle of influence, ultimately, so that that influence can highlight or culminate into an event that highlights Black professional women in a positive light across this country. Now, this is worth pausing on. BGLU is not, by a strict definition, a community organization, the way the Office of Multicultural Interest typically recognizes community organizations. It's a professional women's organization. It has a specific purpose and agenda and specific economic and career goals, not neatly fitting into a CALD community mold. This is BGLU using the political agency to advocate for economic empowerment and personal empowerment for women to progress their respective careers, but in an arena that isn't necessarily corporate. From that meeting, a relationship was cultivated with OMI, and through that relationship, what followed became possible. Between November 2025 and February 2026, BGLU conducted sustained legislative advocacy around Western Australia's proposed Multicultural Act. They attended consultations. They convened workshops at Curtin University, and on the 15th of February, delivered a formal submission. That submission did something specific. It proposed replacing the term CALD, culturally and linguistically diverse, with RLCD, racially, linguistically, and culturally diverse, because CALD erases race. The experience of a white Finnish woman in Australia may be categorically different from the experiences of a Black migrant woman. And these people may not have the same barriers. CALD can make that difference visible. BGLU named the erasure and proposed a fix. So this is not merely participation, it's the context of the contesting of the terms of the recognition. That is political instinct, and understanding that you have to be inside the system and you have to know precisely what you want to ask. This is not unique to BGLU. We've heard it independently from interviews with women who have nothing to do with BGLU. It lives inside of them, and let's take two participants from our interviews. Give you a moment to look at that. Right. Political instinct, understanding that you have to be inside the system. You have to know precisely what to ask, right? The first voice that we hear is Adeyezi, the strategist, who's been elected to state parliament, and she says, government will not come to you. You have to go to government. The only way to change the system is by being inside the system, fully inside, not outside. That is a principle, but the second voice goes further. It names the precise skill that turns contact into outcome. And this is Abena. We called her the convener. You need to understand the minister's story. You need to understand the portfolio she carries. What exactly do you want her to do? You have to be pretty clear in what you're asking. So when you get out of the room, she'll tell you, I'm connecting you to him for you to progress on this conversation. This is what 42% confidence figures cannot measure. It measures whether you feel confident. It does not measure whether you know what to ask when you get in front of people. These women know what to ask. And that knowledge is a form of political agency that the survey didn't quite manage to capture.
Okay, and then to explore political agency more, we asked women about their community participation, through how much they participate in African community organizations, if they attend African community events, and whether they're mentors or leaders within the African community. And you can see from the results on the left-hand side of the slide that there are at least 1/4 of women in the survey who participate in the community in each of these ways. These are not small numbers, which will be illustrated throughout this position. It seems to be a social demanding category of activity. And when you read them alongside the barriers, which we'll come to shortly, consisting of time, money, family, etc., they imply that community participation is not happening by default. Rather, it is happening against what seems to be a grain of considerable constraint. So, for example, one of our interview participants, who we've named Fatima, speaks directly to what that community participation is actually building. And she says, we used to have picnics that we'd hold once a quarter. So we'd all get together. We used to run community events too, to apply for grants, buy books about kids from mixed race backgrounds, just really creating that nourishing environment where our kids could see other kids like them. And then we also have someone who names Sil, the organizer, and she names exactly why the question of mentoring and networking is so structurally loaded for migrant women. She says the networks begin when they start like primary school. It's about what kind of people are they going to know, because that's how they hire each other. So imagine as a migrant, it's very, very difficult to break through.
And what does BGLU do in relation to these numbers, right? The slide here frames the gap precisely. Mid-level and senior level Black African professional women do not have mentors above them who look like them. There's no one higher up the ladder to show them the path or to advocate that this is the path that they need to walk through in Australian corporate life. So what was the solution? BGLU built a trio system of peer mentors, structured horizontal mentoring among members, because the vertical mentoring requires someone above you, but the horizontal is because the women in the room are the resource. Board representation and access to corporate, political, and media decision-making spaces, and having the ability of creating visibility at senior levels does not yet exist. But being present at women in leadership conferences and deliberately putting Black African women in the rooms where sponsorship and decisions happen. So these are not social activities. They're more like structural interventions, a collective response to a structural absence.
Okay. Another set of questions that we asked women was about the top political issues that they cared about. And the gender comparison for a few of these was quite striking. So if you look at the stats on the slide, you'll see that women seem to be consistently more engaged with care rights and community-facing issues that affect daily life. They consistently report higher concern than men in issues including health, education, poverty and equality, and with a 10% difference in family and domestic violence, at double the number of women citing this as the top political issues than men. And one could interpret this pattern as a gendered political consciousness, which does not suggest that men are disengaged with these issues. Instead, the gaps in engagement may suggest that the political agenda women bring to government contact is differently oriented, perhaps more communal, more relational, and more focused on structural protection.
As mentioned earlier with the BGLU's Multicultural Act submission, this is the direct example of what acting out those concerns looks like. The proposal to replace CALD with RLCD is not just a terminological preference. It's an argument that's saying, let's make race visible in policy language, because it matters for health funding, it matters for education targeting, it matters for poverty measurement. The survey captures what women care about. The submission shows what it looks like when caring becomes a formal political act. The BGLU network is about creating a safe space for peer support as well as professional advancement, but the political and the personal are not separate registers here.
Okay, so finally, in this section around political engagement, we were also interested in exploring the question which inquired after the barriers that limited people's political engagement. And as you see on the slide, 49% of women said that they were too busy with work or family, 40% did not feel that they had the power to influence change, and 30% said they did not know enough about Australian politics. Setting these figures against the earlier figures of 82% of women who contacted the politician, we are inclined to suggest something analytically significant. This barrier probably showcased by these responses is not disengagement. Instead, it tells us that the barriers to political engagement could be attributed to a lack of capacity, time, and other resources, or maybe a sense that the institutional channels are not designed for this cohort of people.
Right. Well, what has BGLU done with this constraint? The organization is 100% volunteer powered. Every person who shows up, every submission that gets written, every meeting that's attended, that's done in the margins of someone who has already a very overcrowded life. Now, to address this, the founding team made a specific structural decision. They deliberately stepped back from original leadership roles, so the organization, firstly, wouldn't just be identified by 2 or 3 individuals. In every space, there must be a recognition that any Black professional woman that you see is qualified to speak on an issue, right? The figure, the 49%, tells you exactly why that risk is real, so that the organization doesn't collapse. Whoever steps up is a legitimate representative. One could read this as direct structural response to the visibility and legitimacy trap that small volunteer-led communities often lead and fall into. Sustainable funding, of course, remains unsecured. That's the same pressures that produce the 49% to apply to BGLU itself. That tension is honest, but the data does not necessarily resolve it. The 49% too busy figure is abstract until you hear what it actually sounds like. So, for example, Fatma, the builder, puts it this way: we've got immediate pressing needs just on the basis of our daily lives. It becomes a luxury to talk about party politics when you've come home from work and you're overstressed and someone really bullied you and harassed you, and you don't have any room to think about other things. Her account suggests to us that she considers political engagement to be a luxury, and it hints at where she's thinking or where her political consciousness lies. It sits in the hierarchy of survival. The framing is analytically significant for anyone designing participation pathways. Then there's Cecile, the organizer. She names the economic dimension of volunteerism very directly. Because this is voluntary, you know, people are coming at events. It's voluntary, so they're not paid for that. I need to be paid. I need money for all of that, right? From the BGLU illustration and the interview, we gain a contextualized perspective into the political engagement and the limitations thereof.
Okay, so now we're going to go into our second theme for the discussion, which is discrimination and barriers. So the survey asked participants to describe their experiences of discrimination in open text. The responses included a number of quotes, along with the ones on the screen, which talk about sending people back to their own countries, recounting unsuccessful job hunts, and reduced opportunities in the workplace. Quantitatively, survey responses note that 94% of women in the sample have qualifications recognized in Australia, and yet only 73% are working at the level of those qualifications compared to 78% of men. This 5-point gap sitting on top of the qualification figure may suggest that recognition is not the barrier, perhaps something else is.
Well, BGLU found the same thing in a very stark form. They did their own community research and found, and I'm going to say this, 0 identifiable Black women in CEO positions across the ASX 500. Not one. right? As a result of this founding, one of the foundational elements of BGLU's strategic document, that's called the Black Print, it has a specific goal. At least one Black African woman CEO on the ASX 500 by 2030. A strategy? How about board placements, partnerships with organizations like Australian Institute of Directors, members learning the grammar of institutional power from women already inside of those rooms? The findings did not come from a government report. It came from a community of professional women who decided to count what institutions had failed to count. And I want to introduce these two voices because they're speaking about discrimination from different positions, and both matter. The first is Amara, the Pathfinder. Born in the United Kingdom to Nigerian parents, she holds Australian citizenship. She describes what happens when the state tries to count her. People like me don't get counted as African on the census data, which is ridiculous. What's going to come out when they find out information about me? I'm a white person when I'm not. Amara the Pathfinder, the instrument of measurement, makes her invisible. The census, which is supposed to count everyone, literally renders her white. And that discrimination operating through not a person's intent, but through the architecture of data collection. It's structural and invisible, but it's also how BGL's view racially and linguistically and culturally diverse proposal becomes urgent. If the state cannot count you, how can it design for you? The second voice is Naledi, the navigator. She's an academic and describes going to collect a coffee she had ordered online. I got there and the coffee lady assumed I was an Uber person picking for somebody. I got pissed and I was like, how dare you? I have a PhD. But then I was like, I don't really blame you because all the people that kind of do this work look like me. What Naledi does in this moment alone, in real time, in a coffee shop is extraordinary. She names her anger, she claims her credentials, and then in the same breath refuses to let it be about her. She analyzes the structural logic that produces the stereotype. She does not let it stop at racism, she diagnoses it. Both Amara and Naledi are experiencing discrimination. Both are refusing to be defined by it. Both are, in their different ways, doing something on the agency spectrum that we mentioned earlier. Amara names the invisibility, Naledi names the structure. That refusal is analytical clarity under pressure. That is what the deficit narrative cannot see.
So before we go into our final theme, I actually just want to add an interesting tidbit that I discussed with Ruvi yesterday. So I share Amara's kind of same situation. I was born in England and I have Canadian citizenship. So I also am white, according to census data. And actually, when we designed the survey, we kind of went through answering the questions. And I noticed when I was going through it that the demographic data would count me as white. And so we discussed that change with the team and actually came up with a solution that the demographic data would be able to show what your heritage is or what your ethnicity is. So people like me aren't suddenly white people. And also, before we go to our final theme, I just want to remind you that we are interested in your thoughts and questions. So please feel free to pop them in the chat or be thinking about them for the end of the presentation. So now going into our final theme, we're going to discuss economic engagement. So the survey asked participants to share their engagement in the labor market, specifically how often they work and their occupations. And the results tell us that 45% of women in our survey are employed full-time compared to 66% of men, and only 13% are in management at half the rate of men, despite the fact that, again, 94% hold qualifications recognized in Australia. So reading this, we are inclined to think that credentials do not determine one's career success. It is possible that there is something between the credential and the leadership role where the gap opens. Instead, we could read this as lack of tangible recognition as a structural combination of the networking barriers we discussed, the discrimination accounts we just heard, and something else that the survey itself does not fully illuminate. What the data may suggest is a picture of women who are fully qualified, partially employed, and significantly underrepresented in management, not because of capacity, but perhaps because of the structural conditions in which this capacity operates.
Well, BGLU's stated mission is to normalize Black African women in corporate power, not to celebrate an exceptional individual who breaks through, but to normalize, to make the presence of Black women in senior level positions expected rather than surprising. Mid-level stagnation is the specific problem that BGLU is addressing. The women in the room are qualified. They are working, but they're not making it to a particular floor. And the organization exists in part to build a bridge where they are and where the data says they should already be able to go. Two of the interview participants put a name to this expression. Abena, the convener, says they're fighting to be in the executive or senior level roles, and they're not being given the opportunity because others are being given the opportunities more than them. So you find that they end up doing another degree or another master's or something else. You're overqualified, but you're not moving up in your roles. And Sade, the entrepreneur, names the wall in a single line. We can't really get past certain levels unless you really have to work harder because you're African to get into the Australian market. Harder because you're African, not harder because you're less qualified. Harder because of what you look like when you walk into the room. And that's what that 13% figure may be counting.
So for the final part of this discussion, we want to use a slide whose title is doing quite a bit of work there: unpaid, overqualified, undersatisfied, and still building, by focusing on two survey questions which speak to the voluntary efforts of Africans in Australia and their career satisfaction progress. And you can see the bulk of the statistics there on the left-hand side of the slide, but I'd like to focus on the two. So when answering the question about the unpaid labor they provide, 21% of women state that they do voluntary work for organizations versus 18% of men. And then when expressing how satisfied they feel in their careers and its progress, only 22% of women strongly agreed they were satisfied with their career success compared to 29% of men. Taken together, one could read this as women are giving more to the community, achieving less recognition in the formal economy, and reporting lower satisfaction with their progress. And yet, as the title says, they're still building their lives, their communities, etc. So, Ruvi, what does BGLU make of these two sets of questions?
Well, it's quite simple. The survey counts voluntary labor as a category of activity. The interviews reveal that it's a value system and as a strategically constructed community infrastructure. 100% of BGLU members are unpaid for the organizational work that they do at BGLU. The survey would count them in the 21%, but they are not there by accident. They're there by deliberate choice, building something that the market wouldn't build for them. The three voices from the interviews also make this audible. Cecile, the organizer, says, leaders do a lot of work, a lot of things in the background. But if members are not following, if members are not engaging, you've got to be a strong leader to continue doing that. Abena, the convener, says, I'm not a talker, I'm a doer. I'm very operational. I'm a leader. I want to get things done properly. I don't want any money. I just want to support the African community. Naledi, the navigator, says, my mother always says, if it must be done, it must be done well. For me, what's more way to show than to actually give your time and help build? Three women, three iterations of the same ethic. Invisible labor is seen as a value system, not a burden.
So we've come to the end of our presentation and we're grateful for your time and engagement today. Everything you've heard, I'll just bring up these, okay. Everything you've heard comes from preliminary findings. The people whose experiences sit behind the data are diverse in origin, in migration pathway, in how and when they came to Australia, and in how they built their lives here. We have not tried to flatten that diversity. Instead, we've tried to hold together long enough to ask what patterns emerge when we look specifically through a gendered lens. What we found is that combining the survey, the interviews, and the BGL UK study allowed us to paint a fuller picture than any single source could have done alone. And through that fuller picture, we saw agency appearing in both expected and unexpected places, at a picnic, in a peer mentoring circle, in a submission to a parliamentary consultation. The spectrum we described at the beginning of this presentation is a description of what we found.
What our preliminary analysis suggests is that women's political agency is sophisticated. It's deliberate and it's strategically grounded. May not look like what we've been trained to measure, but it's there. And it brings us to a point which has stayed with us throughout our analysis. The line between the personal and the political for Black migrant women in Australia is very blurred. This is not because women lack clarity about what is political, but often for them, the political happens in private spaces. And the methodological challenge that sits under all of this is that when the political happens in private spaces, it's hard to come up with measures of effectiveness and measures of impact. We've not found a metric that does that well enough yet. But the agency is real and it's contributing to Australian society in ways that are not being captured by the frameworks that we use currently. And so we ask, is it important? Is it really being measured? And what would it take to encourage it, to build on it, and to do the work of building social cohesion that's so important in Australia? I don't have an answer, but we do believe that the data and the women in it are pointing us to the right direction. Thank you.
We're now open for questions, comments, etc. Please be kind.
Thank you so much to Ruvi and Nothando. What an excellent job, and some really thought-provoking data there, thought-provoking commentary. I really enjoyed the way that you integrated the survey data with your case study, which I think is wonderful. Well done, congratulations. I'm going to hand over to our colleague. There are several members of our team here who are supporting the presentation today, and I will hand over to one of them, who is my colleague, Associate Professor David Mickler, who will moderate the discussion because I have to run off to another meeting. Thank you, David.
Great, thanks a lot, Farida, and thanks to Ruvi and Nothando for a fantastic presentation. We have about 10 minutes for question and answer. So if you'd like to either raise your hand, your virtual hand, or put something in the chat, and we'll try and get through a few of those in the time that we have. I see a lot of praise in the chat box so far. Does anyone have any questions or clarifications that they'd like to raise?
Yes, Professor Sam. Oh, let's unmute him. Can we unmute him?
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, good.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Nothando and Ruvi. I enjoyed listening to you, but I would like to say one thing. I mean, I agree with everything that you have said, but I wonder whether a man would have experienced things differently, because I've been here for 44 years now, and what you have described has just gone over the path that I have followed myself. I didn't have anybody to help me, and I needed somebody to guide me on how to maneuver in certain places. But even when you have access, and even when you approach people that you know, I mean, somebody like Tony Booty. Tony was my colleague, and he understands the things you're talking about because we fought these things with him. So it's not Tony refusing to do it. Tony works through a network and the other people who advise him, who handle the material. It is some of those things that stand in the way. I'll give you an example. I don't want to go too long. I invited a minister to come and give a lecture in my class, Minister for Defense. And for some reason, I was more or less prevented from meeting him at the arrival point. I was told to start somewhere else, wait, and I waited for about 20 minutes. He was in class, and the person that was asked to take him to my class had forgotten his name, so couldn't even introduce him to students. Those things happen. And it's not that you need to have access somewhere. I encourage you to do this research, publish it, let people know about it. It's important that people know what you're talking about. It's very important. But I just want to say, knowledge alone is not going to help, because there are people who know it, but they can't do it. There are structures within governments, both in Canberra and at the state level. I worked in government in Canberra. At the time, they were frustrating me. I was actually a consultant to the foreign minister, but I could do certain things. So I just want to leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Ruvi, Nothando, maybe we'll just take the two more questions we have and then respond to all three. So we'll go to Musa and then Chico.
Excellent presentation, ladies. Thank you for profiling BGLU, even though it's still a very young organization and advocating for Black professional women. My question is really around, we often tend to diagnose problems a lot and live in problem land. And I know you're only talking about a certain dimension of your research, but I'm wondering, outside of your research and all your experiences, where are you seeing effective political agency, or do you have any recommendations about, and it came up like through one of the questions where, or the responses where she said, be strategic, know what you're going to ask for when you're in front of the minister. But do you have any other recommendations about how we can be more strategic in our political and economic agency? What does that look like, and where have you seen it working?
Thanks, Musa. Over to you, Chico.
Thank you very much, AI1 and AI2, I call you. That's fantastic. We really appreciate it. Now, I suppose I wanted to reverse your question, because you said, how does gender shape the pursuit of political and economic goals? And I was just wondering, if you reverse that question, what would you be thinking about by saying, how does the political and economic agency or conditions shape the participation of women? Because that to me gave you a different perspective of thinking your structural and internal narrative. Maybe something to think about.
Thanks, Chico. Okay, we've got 3 minutes, so maybe Ruvi and Nothando, if you wanted to find a way to respond to those excellent 3 questions. Over to you.
I think I'd like to take Sam's question first. And as you're speaking, when I was thinking about, you asked about men having the same experiences as women. Obviously, in this presentation, we were focused on the experiences of women, but to be short and quick, I guess, within all of that, we recognize that there's race that may play a factor into your experiences. There's the fact that, if you're coming in as a migrant, like that one of the codes that are talking about forming networks when you're younger, as a migrant, you're not able to form those networks until you move here. If you move here as a 35-year-old adults, that's when you start forming your networks and building in you as well. So those kinds of things obviously do also affect your experiences, regardless of if you're a man or a woman. But we also did want to just highlight kind of the gendered experiences that we got from the data using this presentation.
I'll go to Musa's question of where have we seen this in practice and how have we seen it happening with the data that we've collected with the research. I'll give one example that we couldn't fit in the discussion was we had an experience of an academic who experienced levels of racism and levels of contestation, and then created an African Students Association that's quite vibrant within that community and at that university. And it's the ability to navigate between the community and the institutions effectively and be able to code switch when necessary to say, this is where we need to go, and this is what we're trying to build, and why it's important. It's unfortunate that we were just pressed for time, but the examples were so many from the participants in terms of how they exercised that agency to create solutions for responding to an experience that they had. But yeah, we will probably have to do a paper and explain all of that.
And then Shuchika, really, when you were speaking, what I wrote was, don't have an answer. So interesting, thank you. But I was thinking it can be a bit cyclical. On one hand, you know, it's your gender and your identity that's influencing your experiences, but also it is the structures that you're in, that you come into, that also influence how you, within your identity, have your experiences. Short and quick, but thanks, we'll look more into that.
I'll also respond to Chika in that as migrants, we're not coming from a vacuum, from nothing and landing into a country and suddenly becoming something. There are other structures that we come carrying. Understanding your role as a woman in an African community has got a distinct feature, understanding your role as a leader. But also, when we look at professional women, these are women from all over the world who've worked in many countries at high level positions. They're also coming with that knowledge to a new space and saying, how can we have this space cater for us, knowing and respecting that we come with all of these experiences. And I think that's the thing that needs to be, I don't know, deliberated or balanced out within society.
Thank you very much. And that's actually aligns with what Sam was talking about in terms of the internal structure itself, awareness of how the system works, and being the outsider in the system, knowing who is the inside is not what you know, is actually the wisdom of taking those who are in the inside to actually circumnavigate, that you're talking of the horizontal mentoring rather than the vertical. Sometimes you need both, but that's fantastic. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. We will have to leave it there, but we have recorded the session and it will go up on our website. I've put the link to the website in the chat box. On the website, you can see all of the other publications and data and webinars that are part of the project. So please go and check those out. We will also have upcoming webinars on a range of different topics coming from the project. So please keep checking in with us. It was great to have everyone here today. So thanks for your participation, and most of all, thank you very much to our two presenters, Ruvi and Nothando, for a fantastic presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done, sis. Great presentation.
For coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was more nervous about BGLUs than I was about my profession.
When I saw BGLU members doing this, I was like, no.
You represented us well. We're proud. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.